What if the most important case of your life reached the Supreme Court, but your lawyer had never argued there before? What if hundreds of thousands of immigrants could lose their legal status with a single Supreme Court decision? And what if social media companies could be held legally responsible for how their platforms are designed? These aren't hypothetical questions. They are real legal battles happening right now in courts across the country. That's what we are breaking down today on Wall on Law. Hello, and welcome to the 6th episode of Wall on Law. My name is Jonas Wall, and I am a sophomore at the University of Delaware studying political science, criminal justice, and sociology. I created this podcast because there are major legal updates every week that affects our lives. And as a student, I didn't always understand what those changes meant for me. Wall on Law breaks down how the law actually shows up in everyday life, especially for students, young people, and non-lawyers. In today's episode, we are covering 3 major legal updates. First, we will look at a new public defender office focused on advocacy in the U.S. Supreme Court. Then, we will provide an update on the Haitian temporary protected status ruling that we covered in episode 1. And finally, we'll discuss an ongoing trial involving Instagram, YouTube, and a young Californian woman. First, let's talk about the new public defender office approved this week. On Tuesday, March 10th, the Judicial Conference of the United States approved the creation of the Supreme Court Advocacy Project, along with 4 full-time positions to support it. Let's break this down. First, what is the Judicial Conference? The Judicial Conference of the United States is the main policymaking body for the federal court system. It meets twice a year and is led by the Chief Justice of the United States. The conference is made up of federal judges from across the country who set policies for the judiciary, oversee the federal court's budget, and recommend improvements to how the federal court system operates. During its March meeting, the conference reviewed and approved the Supreme Court Advocacy Project. So what exactly is this project? The project creates a new national office focused on improving legal representation for indigent criminal defendants before the Supreme Court of the United States. Indigent defendants simply refers to individuals who could not afford a lawyer. Under the Constitution, defendants who cannot afford an attorney have the right to one. That right was established in the landmark Supreme Court case, Gideon v. Wainwright, which held that the government must provide counsel to defendants who cannot afford representation in criminal cases. Most criminal cases never go beyond local or state courts, but in rare circumstances, a case may be appealed through multiple levels of the judicial system, from trial courts to appellate courts, and in a very small number of cases, all the way to the Supreme Court. When that happens, the defense attorney who handled the case earlier in the process is often the same lawyer arguing the case before the Supreme Court. And it is typically the first time that the defense attorney has risen to this level. Let's be honest. Practice makes perfect, but the Supreme Court probably isn't the best place to practice. Public defender offices sometimes partner with outside law firms to assist with these cases, but many times they handle them on their own. Justice Elena Kagan has spoken on this issue before, noting that when criminal defense lawyers do not bring in specialists for Supreme Court cases, it is as if they are arguing with one hand tied behind their back. Meanwhile, on the government side, there is already a specialized office dedicated to arguing cases before the Supreme Court, the Office of the Solicitor General. That office coordinates nearly all Supreme Court litigation involving the federal government and is staffed by attorneys who focus on Supreme Court cases. Because of that, critics have long argued that an imbalance exists. The Supreme Court Advocacy Project is intended to help address that imbalance. The new office will create a national resource within the federal defender system dedicated to Supreme Court litigation. The attorneys hired for the project will specialize in high court advocacy, helping public defenders identify strong cases, prepare petitions asking for the court to hear a case, and develop arguments for cases that reach the Supreme Court. Importantly, public defender offices will not be required to use this office, but they will now have the option to collaborate with experienced Supreme Court advocates if they choose. So why does this matter? Because the American justice system is built on the principles of fairness, due process, and equal protection under the law. Those principles do not disappear as cases move higher through the judicial system. In fact, the stakes often become even greater. By creating a specialized office dedicated to Supreme Court advocacy for indigent defendants, the judiciary is attempting to ensure that individuals who cannot afford their own attorneys still have access to high-quality representation at the very highest level of the legal system. In other words, whether someone has the resources to hire a top law firm or must rely on a public defender, the goal is the same: ensuring that justice before the Supreme Court is argued on as level a playing field as possible. Now, I want to turn back to the Haitian Temporary Protected Status ruling that we covered in episode 1. To briefly recap, a federal judge temporarily blocked the Trump administration from ending legal protections for Haitian immigrants living in the United States. If those protections had been removed, roughly 350,000 Haitians currently living in the United States could have faced deportation. During that episode, we talked about an important point. Just because a federal judge blocks a policy does not mean the case is over. The federal government can still appeal that decision to higher courts, including the Supreme Court of the United States. And as of Wednesday, March 11th, the Trump administration has formally asked the Supreme Court to intervene and allow the government to move forward with ending Haiti's TPS protections. The court has not yet ruled on the request. However, the justices have asked the plaintiffs, the immigrants and advocacy groups challenging the policy, to file a response to the administration's request by next Monday. So at this point, the Supreme Court is considering whether it should step in and allow the policy to take effect while the legal fight continues. While we don't know if the Supreme Court will hear the case, we can look to recent decisions for possible clues. For example, in October of last year, the Supreme Court allowed the administration to move forward with terminating TPS protections for hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan migrants while litigation continued. Based on that earlier ruling, some legal analysts believe the court may be inclined to side with the administration again. But it is far from certain, and the justices could still decide differently depending on the legal arguments in this case. For now, the court has just asked for additional filings, and we will continue to follow any updates as the situation evolves. Finally, let's talk about an ongoing trial involving Instagram, YouTube, and a young California woman. In 2023, a lawsuit was filed in Los Angeles County Superior Court by Kaylee GM's mother on behalf of her daughter, who was a minor at the time. For privacy reasons, Kaylee's last name is partially redacted in court filings, which is why she is named as Kaylee GM. The original lawsuit named 4 major technology companies as defendants, including Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, Google, which owns YouTube, Snap Inc., which owns Snapchat, and TikTok. Kaylee, the plaintiff, alleges that her childhood use of social media contributed to serious mental health problems. Her legal team argues that these harms could have been prevented if the companies had implemented stronger protections for young users. In January 2026, both Snap Inc. and TikTok reached settlements with the plaintiff just days before the trial was scheduled to begin. Because of those settlements, the case moved forward only against Meta and Google. But that raises a natural question. If the lawsuit was filed in 2023, why is the trial only happening now? The answer is that large civil lawsuits take time. Before a case reaches trial, the parties go through a process called discovery, where both sides exchange evidence, gather internal documents, and question witnesses under oath. There are also numerous pretrial motions and procedural steps that courts must resolve before a jury can hear the case. The trial officially began on February 9th, 2026, roughly 3 years after the lawsuit was first filed. Because Kaylee is now over the age of 18, she is continuing the lawsuit in her own name. She testified during the trial that she began using YouTube at age 6 and Instagram at age 9, and that her use of social media quickly became addictive. She told jurors that she later developed anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts. Kaylee's past psychotherapist also testified, stating that excessive social media use was a factor to her mental health conditions. So what is the plaintiff's legal argument? Kaylee's lawyers argue that Meta and Google purposefully designed their platforms to keep young users engaged and addicted in order to increase profits. They claim the companies were negligent because they failed to warn users about risks and ignored evidence that their platforms could harm young people's mental health. Specific features cited in the lawsuit include things like autoplay videos and beauty filters, which the plaintiff's lawyers say can distort a person's self-image. If you've ever opened Instagram for 5 minutes and looked up an hour later, you might understand the argument. So we now understand the plaintiff's side. But what is the company's defense? Something not mentioned above is that Kaylee had a very rough childhood marked by abuse and family instability. And Meta's attorneys argue that Kaylee's mental health struggles stem from those other factors in her life. Meanwhile, Google argues that YouTube provides tools designed to protect users, including features that allow people to delete comments, limit viewing time, and reduce harassment. The company says Kaylee simply did not make use of those tools. Both companies also emphasize that they have heavily invested in parental controls and online safety programs aimed at protecting younger users. Additionally, on Wednesday, March 11th, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg testified in the trial. During questioning, he addressed the fact that Kaylee was able to access Instagram at 9 years old, even though the platform officially requires users to be at least 13. Zuckerberg stated that Meta does not allow people under 13 on its platforms, but said verifying a person's age online is very difficult. However, the plaintiff's lawyers confronted Zuckerberg with internal company documents, suggesting that teenagers and younger users were an important target demographic. One internal presentation reportedly said, "If we want to win big with teens, we must bring them in as tweens." Zuckerberg responded that the quote had been taken out of context. The trial is expected to continue for several more weeks, meaning no verdict has been reached yet. So why does this case matter? One major reason is that the verdict could affect how courts interpret Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. This law was originally designed to encourage the growth of online platforms. Specifically, Section 230 protects internet platforms by not holding them responsible for content posted by their users. And on a platform like YouTube or Instagram, it is entirely content posted by users. However, Kaylee's lawyers are not focusing on the content itself. Instead, they argue that the companies should be held liable for how their platforms were designed. If a jury agrees with that argument, it could weaken the effectiveness of Section 230 and open the door to thousands of similar lawsuits claiming that social media platforms are harmful by design. Finally, although this case is being tried in California, its impact could extend far beyond the state. Both Instagram and YouTube operate platforms used by tens of millions of Americans and billions of users worldwide. If the verdict leads to changes in how these apps are designed, those changes could affect users across the United States and potentially even across the world. Because of these broader implications, many legal experts believe that the issues raised in this case could eventually reach the Supreme Court of the United States. And as always, as soon as we hear new developments about this case, we will be right back here with more updates. So that brings us to the big picture. Across all three stories, we're seeing the same underlying question. How does the legal system adapt when the stakes are high and the systems around us are changing? The creation of a new Supreme Court Advocacy Office shows how the justice system is trying to ensure that everyone has access to high-quality legal representation, even at the highest court in the country. The Haitian Temporary Protected Status case highlights the enormous power that courts can have over the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. And the social media trial raises a question that could shape the future of the internet. Should tech companies be legally responsible not just for the content on their platforms, but how those platforms are designed? These are different cases and different issues, but they all point to the same reality. The law is not set in stone. It's constantly evolving, and those changes affect real people in real ways. And that's exactly why conversations like these matter. Before we close out, I want to say thank you for listening to the 6th episode of Law on Law. If you found this episode helpful, or if it helped make the law feel a little more understandable, that's exactly the goal of this podcast. In future episodes, we will continue to break down major legal and political developments, and focusing on how those decisions actually affect everyday people, especially students. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow or subscribe to Law on Law so you don't miss future updates. You can also find episode summaries and more information at lawonlaw.com. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time on Law on Law.